Thank you very much, Tanya, for that great overview, and it really kind of gives us a good idea of the breadth of work and interest that we will be dealing with throughout the next 2 days. Our next speaker is Professor Briony, who is a professor of art history at UCL, University of London. She completed her doctoral research on the Russian and French avant-gardes at Essex University before joining the History of Art department at the Open University in 1980 and the University College of London, UCL, in 1990. She was made reader in 1997 and professor in 2005. Briony has published extensively on 20th century and contemporary art, and has produced books including On Abstract Art, 1997, The Infinite Line, 2004, and Eva Hesse Studio Work, 2009. She has written widely on artists including Gabriel Orozco, Ronnie Horn, Viha Somins, I'm not pronouncing this probably right, Ed Rushka, Rachel Whiteread, David Batchelor, and has also focused on the work of American sculptor Eva Hesse, writing for the retrospective on the artist curated by Elizabeth Sussman at San Francisco's MoMA in 2002. So without further ado, Briony, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting me to speak on Mira Schendel today. I have to say, a bit of an imposter, but I'm very pleased to be here. Mira Schendel is an artist who seems both part and not part of the Brazilian avant-garde, both a key artist in a historic moment and out of key with the other artists associated with it, and by extension, roughly with her, like Lydia Clark, Lydia Papp, and so on. I should emphasize from the outset that I have no credentials to speak of Schendel's work in depth, because I haven't studied it in depth like the other people speaking today, but I have seen her work, quite a lot of her work, in a more casual way, and I've thought about it quite a lot in relation to rather different concerns, my own, with the problems of abstraction. So I'm going today to try to put together some of those thoughts and to articulate them. They are, I hasten to add, very basic questions. I'd like to call them, of course, fundamental questions, but we'll see. It depends how things turn out. Clay Perry's photographs of Mira Schendel, taken when she had her show at the Signals Gallery in 1966, are very compelling, and they stage a game of hide and seek that's close to the feel of the work sometimes, the play of seeing and not seeing, touching, handling, that seem important in all of her work, whether it's the Droginos as here or the other work that I shall talk about today, in which opacity and transparency take a different form. And the work I want to think about in particular is the work that she made using letraset and clear acrylic sheets. There can be many ways to opacity, and language is one of them. Now, concerns with language are often thought of as the antithesis of modernist concerns with abstraction. But as long as we do not take as read hegemonic, high modernist, and especially US accounts of abstraction, then this is very far from being the case. So whilst the look of language can and has been deployed as the negation of what were dominant beliefs in an all-over expressive surface, the look of language can serve abstraction in other ways, can serve abstraction in other ways. And Mira Schendel's work would, for me, be a case in point. Luis Perez Oramas curated this year's São Paulo Biennale, and he was also the curator of the MoMA show of Schendel's work alongside that of Leon Ferrari a couple of years ago. I mention this only because it struck me not only as part of the core problematic of the Biennale, which didn't include Schendel, that Pérez Oramas ended up showing, and I can't be the only person to have felt this, ended up showing work often in the manner of a work by Mira Schendel. And this is actually a drawing by French psychiatrist Fernand Deligny, a drawing suspended between acetate sheets by Pérez Oramas from the ceiling to show their transparency, even though these drawings were never produced as art. They were instead the graphic mappings of the movements of autistic children in the community that Deligny made in 1968 in the mountains of the Cévennes, where Deligny devised the notion there of the mute image that communicates otherly, differently from spoken language. Now, this type of suspended drawing, the wandering graphic marks, ligne d'air, as Deligny had put it, the layering, the seeing through the tracing paper, all this is not unlike the monotypes of Schendel, but very, very like them when they're hung from the ceiling in an art space. Now, I know I'm digressing there, but my point is only that rather than think of this now as an unconventional intervention into a gallery space, we can think of this as another convention of art display that's become or becoming pretty well established. But I guess the more interesting question is whether, with their incorporation of alphabets, these works are mute or silent, or whether drawing speaks. And I guess I think all this makes it possible to come now to Schendel and think rather differently about what was her contribution. And as I say, I do so from a rather different perspective, because what seems to me interesting, and in a sense Pérez Oramas urged this in his Biennale, is to think not only again but also differently about abstraction's relation to language, or rather not to language as a signifying system in this instance, not to words as units of signification, but to letters, cut loose not only from a language system, but also from something as material as a set of letter-set letters. This is a notebook Schendel made with letter-set letters in 1970. Arguably, it's now because letter-set is pretty well obsolete as a design tool that we can see it in this way. But I think it's materiality that we recognize because it's obsolete as a system, but it was also probably evident, palpably so, when letter-set was first produced in the early 1960s, after which Schendel fairly soon began to use it in her work. It was a very basic technology, a system of commercial lettering of dry transfers applied by hand, but let's call it a technology, in which case these works can perhaps help us to think about the problem of abstraction and technology as it exists now. I don't mean literally to compare the kind of technologized abstraction we see now, but that the merging of those supposed opposites, art and language, art and artifact, art and technology, art and typography, is very far from new and dramatized particularly powerfully in Schendel's work. So in part, what I'm going to talk about will be the materiality of lettering, not simply letters. But I'll also think about how different theoretical propositions about language might be at stake here. Notably, to think about how differently Willem Flusser thought about the gesture of writing, how different that is from the way Roland Barthes thought about the gesture in his writings on Twombly and Masson. All this may seem very far from the problem of abstraction as we might find it in the more familiar shape of an abstract work of art such as this. But I think it's important to stress that Schendel seems to have worked consistently with rather than against abstraction. And indeed, her works from the 1980s like this showed her continuing interest in suspending roughly geometric forms and markings in space, where often a line or an edge will wander off or fray or reveal a texture, like that uneven surface of oil stick on paper of the one I showed you previously. In The Gesture of Writing, Flusser wrote about the relations between technologies and mental structures. And as a philosopher of the shape of things, he's best known perhaps for his attention to the mental patterning rather than the signifying system that's language. And as a philosopher of new media in a digital age, he published many of his major writings in the 1980s on the consequences of the digital galaxy at a time when the internet revolution was exploding onto the scene of all our lives. His approach to technologies of writing could not be more different from Roland Barthes. Take, for instance, Barthes writing on Twombley's works on paper, on Twombley's calligraphic gesture, where language becomes a blur or a blotch. Barthes is consumed by what he calls the graphic substance, that is the nervous or gauche work of the hand, mediated by the drawing instrument, a brush or a crayon or a pencil, the hands becoming through the trace or mark on a surface. By comparison, Flusser's universe of technical images, his techno-imaginary that would take into account what history looked like post-photography, in the light of the circulation and distribution of images that marks out our image world from previous image worlds. Flusser distrusted the idea of automatic writing, but he marked out an imaginary and non-rational place for new media that was like a technophile mirror image, that is to say, the almost exact reverse of Barthes' tracing in drawing of an erotics of desire. But I guess what Flusser has to say becomes far more relevant when we think of Schendel's typewriter drawings like this, the so-called datiloscritos or typed writings that she made, I think, at night during periods of insomnia. Think of them then as her night drawings, even her insomnia drawings. For Flusser, the typewriter is a mechanical instrument, a machine for writing that presses ink into paper, just as the hand digs into paper, scratching as it writes. Now, Barthes, too, had talked of scratching, but this is rather different. It's a mechanized impression of ink inscribed by the repetitive click of a typewriter. It's stutter, as Flusser would have it, echoing, as he put it, the stutter of the world. Now, this is certainly not Deligny's notion of the mute image, which uses an instrument of language to communicate in terms other than language, but it is a way of thinking about wordlessness. And of course, whilst Flusser insists on the linear sequencing of the typewriter's texts, Schendel's are sequences of linear thought, sequences without linear meaning, but blocks of differentiated textured type. If Flusser is concerned with the relations between writing and thinking, then what sort of thought is involved in Schendel's drawings? Night thoughts, perhaps, night stutter, even. Now, here's another one. Now, in some respects, a drawing by Eva Hesse, like this one from 1966, of hand-drawn little crosses on squared paper would seem to be situated at the theoretical crossover between these positions. And of course, I'm not the first to make the comparison between Schendel and Hess. It's kept impressing itself on me, the similarities, not only of some of their drawing practice. This is a window drawing by Eva Hesse. This one of Schendel's oil stick drawings, as well as the way the woman artist is staged in Clay Perry's photograph of Schendel, not so unlike this time-life photo of Eva Hesse. I hardly need say that far from mute, such a photograph speaks in already highly conventionalized terms. But where there's dark, there is also light. And it's really this set of works that use letraset in various ways that I'm thinking about, rather than the typed writings that I referred to before, either on rice paper or held between acrylic sheets, transparent acrylic sheets. Now, Flusser would come to see alphabetic writing as having no future. And from this point of view, it's as if these containers for scattered letters were not sites of the origin of language, but almost a dustbin of its leftovers. But of course, there's much more that is different in Schendel's work from, say, Eva Hesse's than is similar. And Schendel's relationship to basic technologies like letraset as a system of organization and typewriting are part of this. And I don't want to risk technologizing her work, but to see that her materials are specific, and so the effects of the work as well. What swarms and clusters and scatters are letters of the alphabet, habitual shapes that never do coalesce into words. The works are wordless, as I say. The letters teem across a transparent field. It's not yet writing, or it's not yet writing, as Barth put it, armed by culture. Schendel herself said that her monotypes were the result of her wanting to capture discourse at its moment of origin. The acrylic laminate allowed her to show the other side of the letters, to show text reverse, transforming text, as she put it, into anti-text, allowing for a circular reading. So she goes on, the text is at the center and the reader or viewer is in motion, transferring, as she put it, time from the work to the reader. This is unlike the time of reading, as it's directed by the sequence of letters that have been formed into writing and which follows a linear sequence, and offers, I think, another kind of temporal experience of the work. But of course, the other powerful component here is easy to lose unless you're there in an installation of work, and that is the way the light is just as important as the letters. In the monotypes, the texture is made out of both. So what she called the attempt to bring about drawing through transparency was also to infuse them with light. The acrylic sheets could allow her to do things she couldn't do, she said, with glass to join the sheets, and not just in the graphic objects, but especially in a work like this, Tate's Untitled from 1972. Pressed between acrylic sheets, almost like insects caught in amber, these letters are scattered. They're scattered letters of the alphabet. And rather than seen from the front, as you would see a picture on the wall, the viewer can walk round this and see it in the round front and back. The image is suspended, but it's in rotation in these terms because it's seen in this circular movement. The centrifugal movement of this one on rice paper now, rather than clear and see-through, is to generate circular movements within the square, but also around the object as it hangs. Now, however spare and elegant these are as physical objects, they have a palpable presence in the world, and they're made out of materials that have certain effects. They're certainly not virtual. They're not technical images, as Flusser would call a photograph, for example. But as I've said, the material is maybe more evident because their technologies are no longer new, but really rather archaic. The circular format makes the rotational movement very clear, but also suggests a lens or viewfinder, this one much thicker, into which the letters are deeply embedded, making their spatial location hard to fathom. Now, in some respects, these suggest something like a photograph, literally, of course, if you think of a photograph as a drawing in light, without being a photograph and without being a technical image in the way that a photograph is. It suggests a field of vision in which the letters of the alphabet scatter and disperse. But those letters are insistently typographic still, all the more so because they exist in groups rather than in sequences. They seem to exist between the typographic and the photographic without resolving or reducing into either. I think they invite us to think differently about abstraction and the alphabet. To say this is not to say that letter shapes resolve into being writing, or to say that the letters function only as formal elements, but nor is it to deny that they have remarkably elastic shape-making possibilities. In order to get a sense of them, it's important, I think, that we're not blind to shifting technologies of making a meaning, but also that we do not succumb to technophilia. The term post-digital doesn't mean that we've finished with the digital or that the technical revolution that we've been experiencing is necessarily over, but that we're able to take some critical perspective on it. As made things, Schendel's works allow us to think about how art can get made out of changing technological conditions. If we imagine Flusser's prediction that writing would eventually become in the future redundant, we could even imagine these as vision of what its component parts might once have looked like. These are, as you can see, very preliminary thoughts. But I think that it's timely to look at a work like this one, again the Tate's 1972 work, and think of it as an art experiment that demands or invites us to think differently, not only to situate the work in its time, but to claim it for now. And the question for me seems to be how to describe that space in which this work operates, deliberately cast adrift not only from the wall, but from language as a signifying system, as well as from the typographic systems of commercial design, in a kind of no man's land where lettering as spectral shapes hover or float in the field of vision, as if the shapes of vision itself is what is at stake here. Thank you.